questions, we will also take question breaks throughout the webinar. Please ask your questions using the chat box in the lower left corner of the screen. If you can't find that, if you are online with us, if you look for a small circle with a speech bubble in the lower left-hand corner of your screen and click that, it should open the chat box. If you have questions about specific projects or very specific situations, please reserve that and have a conversation with Karen outside of the webinar. She's available and more than happy to talk with you about your specific needs. The webinar is going to be available for viewing on our YouTube channel, so if you do get a little lost or cut off, you should be able to view the whole webinar there. As I mentioned in the beginning of the webinar, if you are having trouble viewing, either because your Skype connection is just showing you a blank screen or you are a call-in, you're joining us via phone, the reminder email that you got from us had a PDF attachment. That PDF is of the slides. You can follow along using that, or else there is a link in the chat box that if you just scroll up a little bit, you'll see it is a link to our website where there's also another copy of the PDF of the slides that you can open and follow along. If you're having problems hearing, I see we have one or two comments about that here. It may be a problem on your end. You can jump out and jump back in. That's certainly an option. And as I mentioned, we are recording this, so you can watch this again at your convenience. So with all of that housekeeping, I am going to turn it over to Karen to start talking with you about planning projects.
Thank you, Shelby. We wanted to separate our two categories and webinars this year just to make sure that we could really concentrate on some of the aspects of the planning category grants with all of our applicants, to make sure that you knew that there was a great opportunity for you to do some projects that might be a little bit out of the norm of what you would normally consider with Keystone grants. So our planning project category is a little different and a little special. We realize that there's an important funding gap for non-capital projects in the preservation community, so we expanded the Keystone Grant Program to include these. And they're always projects that have a special planning focus. Please note that it does use a slightly different application in the ESA portal system, so make sure that you're applying under the right category if you're interested in submitting a planning grant for consideration. It does take on some of the same aspects of the Keystone Grant, so it does need to somehow support a National Register eligible or listed property, and these are reimbursable grants, and they do require a cash match. You'll also notice that the grant rewards requests are lower than our capital category, so requests can be made from $5,000 to $25,000, and if you'll notice, since it has a cash match, your actual project costs are really $10,000 to $50,000. Next slide, please. Our planning projects account for about a third of the total number of applications that we receive annually, and it does cover a variety of different types of projects, and these are just sort of some simple guidelines, but of course you can be a little creative and come up with something else if it sort of fits into these categories. Obviously, we see National Register nominations as well as archaeology projects, and then two different types of planning projects, one that are more building focused, that are sort of an idea of a stewardship. If you're with a historic house museum and you're looking to do a historic structures report or some kind of planning document that would maybe plan for a future capital project, such as plans and specifications, that falls under this category. So essentially, if you're not hiring a contractor to make a physical change to a building, this is the category that you want to apply under. We also expanded this to meet some community preservation goals, so such projects such as design guidelines or thematic studies in a community that would really encourage preservation as a whole. This is the right place to be. And finally, we're always a huge advocate of cultural resource survey. We certainly can't understand what to preserve if we don't know if it exists. So cultural resource survey has always been a huge priority for the Pennsylvania State Historic Preservation Office. And again, we always encourage applications coming in for that type of project. With that, I'm going to turn the presentation over to April, who will talk a little bit more about National Register nominations and what types of projects we usually see under those project category.
Thanks, Karen. So as she just mentioned, Keystone Planning Grants can be used to fund National Register of Historic Places nominations for either historic districts or individual properties. The National Register is an honorary program and doesn't place restrictions or obligations on property owners. And it can be an effective educational and planning tool. Preparing a successful nomination, especially for large districts, can be quite an undertaking, and the nomination process averages at least a year from start to finish. The process begins with our office's eligibility evaluation, and preparers work with our staff to edit their drafts in advance of review by the State Historic Preservation Board and ultimately the National Park Service. In order to pursue Keystone funding for a nomination, the property or district must already be determined to be eligible for the National Register, which we'll cover a little bit more later in the presentation. Next slide. Our funding priority generally leans toward historic districts over individual property nominations, as they usually benefit a greater number of resources, and so there's the opportunity for greater public impact. We do accept requests to fund nominations for individual properties, but applicants must make a very compelling case that explains why and how an individual nomination is a good use of Commonwealth funds and will further the preservation of an important resource. This point is really worth expanding on just a little bit more. If your grant application is requesting funding for a nomination, to be competitive, it's critical that you make a strong case that this property or district is really deserving of listing and that the nomination can't be completed without grant funding to hire a consultant. You'll need to clearly identify the specific ways listing will benefit the property or district and persuasively explain those benefits and emphasize the community need and the public good. Your application is your opportunity to really sell this project, and you have to make that a strong case. Next slide. Our office is actively promoting ways to increase the diversity and inclusion of more different places and people in National Register listings. We are looking for more nominations to come from places like Cameron County, which is the only county in Pennsylvania without a National Register listing, and for property types like barns, which are an iconic part of our landscape but are not well represented in the National Register. We're committed to telling more diverse stories through the National Register, stories like Mount Zion AME Church's pivotal role in the end of school segregation in Pennsylvania. And we're looking for places that reflect the fight for women's right to vote and the suffrage movement. And also, we want to start paying more attention to our recent past and important trends like the civil rights or environmental movements of the 1970s. One of our blog posts last year highlights some of our recent efforts and the different types of groups and people and places that we hope will be featured in future nominations. So if you're looking for ideas for how to broaden the National Register representation for your area, check out this blog post. It's linked here in this slide. Next slide. If you're interested in submitting a grant application to fund a National Register nomination, please make sure there is a recent and detailed evaluation for the district or the property within the last 5 years. You'll need this detailed and current guidance from us, usually in the form of an eligibility evaluation, to develop a successful scope of work and a competitive application. The eligibility evaluation will identify areas and periods of significance and will provide appropriate boundaries. These are all things that could impact the scale of your nomination and therefore the cost you'll be looking to fund. The evaluation will also include current guidance for preparing the form and supporting documentation, how to submit drafts to our office and the board and the National Park Service review processes. Check our online database to find copies of eligibility evaluations and talk to our National Register staff if you have an idea for a nomination for a property or district that hasn't been recently evaluated, or if you need a detailed evaluation and current guidance about the nomination process to put together your scope of work. We'll talk a bit more about being eligible for the National Register later in the presentation, but for now I'll turn things back over to Karen for the next category of grants.
Thank you, April. Obviously, archaeology projects and resources are very important to Pennsylvania, so our Keystone Grant projects in the category project, oh my gosh, excuse my stumbling. Obviously, archaeology projects are something that's covered within this grant category as well. We see a wide variety of potential projects that support these sensitive resources, in addition to field schools and complex projects that are also used to investigate lost features at historic sites and to support reconstructing missing elements. Please note, you may not apply to the Keystone Grant Program for projects that were a requirement of mitigation consultation with our office. For example, if you had received federal or state funding and through consultation with the other side of our office are required to do archaeological investigations, the Keystone Grant Program cannot be a source of funding to do that project. And also, there is a large document that deals with guidelines for archaeological investigations that our office has produced, and any applications have to be compliant with those guidelines. Next slide, please. What we see an awful lot of projects coming in through the planning category are ones that assist with stewardship of historic resources. These run the gamut of historic structures reports or individual buildings that focus on preservation plans or conditions assessments. And we also encourage these kinds of projects to prepare architectural plans and specifications for a future competitive application in the construction category. It's a wonderful tool and a way to really encourage strong stewardship at your historic sites. It's something that we always encourage with our partners to be prepared with. But do remember that all projects must comply with the Secretary of Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties. Thank you. Next slide, and I guess we are going to kick this over to Corey. Thanks.
Thanks, Karen. One of the other categories of planning work that can be supported with the Keystone program are tools and plans that are useful to municipalities for sort of bigger policy goals. So these could be at the county level, a county preservation plan that might be an outgrowth or a companion to the county comprehensive plan. Counties actually are required to consider historic properties in their as part of their planning responsibilities by state law. So we've seen a number of communities across the Commonwealth, Erie County and Northampton County most recently, utilize our funds to develop county level historic preservation plans. But that might also be at the municipal level, where your city or town or township might develop a preservation plan for enacting ordinances or identifying other tools and strategies that are needed to preserve historic places within your community. And then a third sort of piece of the toolbox are design guidelines that might be used either for kind of advisory purposes to give some inspiration and guidance to property owners in your community, or by an architectural review board or historical commission or some other body that has some responsibility under a local preservation ordinance. The guidelines are kind of a critical tool to help communicate to both decision makers as well as applicants and property owners what's expected of them. So all of those are those types of projects are fundable under the project category here. Next slide, please. And then a companion to those planning documents are survey work, as Karen indicated. This could be large scale, looking kind of at a reconnaissance level across a pretty big swath of land, or in a particular community, or might be focused on a more thematic grouping of properties or property types. Churches, African American resources, and Karen's already talked a little bit about archaeological survey. I will say that you'll hear it towards the end of this presentation about a new software system that we'll be rolling out in the next couple of months that will impact the way that survey projects will be managed and scoped. So if this is something that your community is actively considering, I would encourage you to be in touch with us very soon to get some guidance on how to solicit proposals and develop a methodology that would be consistent with that new PA share system, because it is going to be a departure from what has been expected and done previously. So thank you very much, and we can move on.
Thank you, Karen, April, and Corey. We are here at our first question break. So we had a few things come in through the chat. Just a reminder, we do have the link to the slides up there if you're still having problems viewing our screens. We had a question that I am just going to repeat that was answered in the chat because it is a good reminder for everybody. We had a question, is there a list of eligible projects online? And you can use the CRGIS database that is available through our website, and April kindly included the link in the chat. You can use CRGIS to find out if the place that you are interested in applying for a Keystone grant or you know, a survey project or what have you, you can find out what we already have about it in there, and if you need to get an updated evaluation. We do that system, the CRGIS database, is going to be online through March 1st, at which point it will be taken offline, and users will need to use PA Share exclusively, but that does not impact your preparation for the Keystone grants, and that you can still get access to that system and use it while you're preparing your application. We did have another question come in about archaeological sites, and maybe this is a good one for April to address. Can a suspected archaeological site with no extant structures become National Register eligible or listed? Must it be to qualify?
An archaeological site can be listed in the National Register. That could be a nomination project that you want to pursue. You'll first need to make sure that the site has been determined to be eligible. So you'd have to submit information to our office so that we can review it and see if we agree that it meets the National Register criteria. So if you are interested in an archaeological site and you don't think it's been evaluated by our office, or it's a very dated evaluation, reach out to me or one of my colleagues and we can work with you to make sure that the property is evaluated before the grant deadline.
Okay, we had, let's see, a question that I will ask Corey to respond to. Can this be used to establish a HERB?
So I think that what you're referring to is a HARB, HARB, Historic Architectural Review Board. That is a body under that would be created through a ordinance, local ordinance, under the Historic District Act. Yes, we have funded the development of ordinances and the accompanying documentation that's needed to establish local historic districts through the Keystone program. I do want to say that, you know, the important sort of qualifier for that would be that the National Register eligibility requirement still pertains. So we would have to have some there'd have to be some National Register listed or eligible resources in that community that would be impacted in order to, or invoked here in order to apply that funding for the local program. I'll just say that if that's something that I'm not sure what community you're from, but myself and my colleagues Brian Van Sweden and Bill Callahan are the community planners. So depending on where you are in the state, I'd encourage you to reach out to one of us early so that we can talk about what that process would involve.
Great, thank you, Corey. Cheryl, since that was your question, if you I had my mute on. Oh my goodness. I am so sorry. Karen, anything else to add in those questions, or should we move on?
I think we can move on. I think there's one more that talks about PA share, but we'll be addressing that a little bit later in the presentation. But thank you for reminding us of that, Andrew. Good, thank you. Right. So since we talked about what this program can be used for, I thought we should probably continue on to talk about some of the eligibility requirements of the grant program, just to make sure that you're in line and your organization or entity are eligible to apply. The Keystone Grant Program is only eligible entities include nonprofit organizations, generally listed as a 501c3, or to municipal governments. The enabling legislation that created the grant program did have a requirement that nonprofit organizations who are funded through the program would be in existence for at least 5 years. But don't worry, if your organization is not, we do allow our applicants to work with a fiscal sponsor who would actually be the applicant, grant funding, and the contract would flow through that other entity, and you would have some kind of cooperative agreement outside of the Commonwealth that sort of articulates what each component of the organization is responsible for. Now, the construction category does have visitation requirements or open accessibility to the public, and that does not necessarily follow through onto the planning category applications. But we do ask for visitor information, and that's mostly just to gauge the community impact of your site. We certainly recognize that there has been a lot of change in our organization and your visitation within the last 10 months. So you can certainly answer those questions using pre-COVID-19 numbers from calendar 2019 to answer those. We always are very interested to see how you've engaged with your community during this sort of silent phase for your organization. So you may certainly share with us your virtual programming or outreach that the organization might have offered over this last calendar year. And obviously, if you're an applicant that's a governmental entity who's applying for design guidelines, none of this visitation information really is germane to you, and you can not answer that question. With that, I'll slide the presentation handle over to April to talk about the National Register requirements for the program.
Okay, thanks. So the Keystone Grants enabling legislation requires that the funding focus on historic resources defined as eligible for or listed in the National Register of Historic Places. To qualify for a Keystone Grant, properties must be formally listed in the National Register, either individually or as a contributing resource within a listed historic district, or they must have been evaluated by our office and found to be eligible for listing. Our evaluation must have been made within the past 5 years. Next slide. Before you begin your grant application, you'll need to find out if your property is individually listed or is contributing to a listed district, or if it's not listed, whether our staff have ever evaluated it. You can find this out through our online database. If the property is listed or is part of a listed district, you're good to go. You just need our database's SHPO ID number for the property to add that into the application. If the property is not in our records or we have a limited record without much detail, you'll need to submit a resource survey form, and soon, to have the property's National Register eligibility evaluated. If the property has been evaluated and was found to be eligible, but it was more than 5 years ago, you'll need to provide updated info to have us confirm the property's eligible status. You can contact our National Register staff for guidance about what type of updated info you'll need to provide. It will vary based on the existing information and the property itself. Next slide. If you do need to submit a resource survey form or updated information, a standard National Register eligibility evaluation takes about 30 days. So you need to do this by the last week of January so that your property's eligibility status is confirmed prior to the grant deadline. You can be working on your grant application while you wait for the results of our evaluation. But again, please try to get us that info as soon as possible. Next slide. Be aware that just because the property is recognized locally and has a plaque or is within a locally designated district, the property may not have National Register status or may never have been evaluated for the National Register. So check again our online database to confirm the property's National Register status. Next slide. Also, while there are over 3,000 Pennsylvania properties and districts listed in the National Register, only 170 of those are also National Historic Landmarks. That is a special distinction in addition to a National Register designation and is separate from the National Register program, but our online database will also show that status. If your property is a national landmark, you'll definitely want to emphasize that in your application. Next slide. So to recap this section, 2 of the first steps as you consider applying for a grant are to look up our ID number for your property and confirm what your property's current National Register status is. The property needs to be listed in the National Register either individually or as part of a district, or eligible for the National Register and evaluated or confirmed as eligible within the past 5 years. Use our current online database, CRGIS, to look up the property's ID number and confirm whether it's listed within a listed district, recently evaluated as eligible, or if you need to submit a complete resource survey form or updated information. All applications, regardless of your property status, will require the property's SHPO ID number, sometimes also known as the key number, and you can find that in CRGIS. The link to CRGIS is here on this slide. If, after looking up your property in our CRGIS program, you still aren't sure what its National Register status is, or if you think you need to submit a resource survey form or updated information, please contact the National Register staff. We'll be happy to help, and do that soon. When contacting one of our staff members for National Register questions, if you can, please do it via email and include the name of the property and the current full street address for the property that you're interested in. That way we can look it up for you and respond with all the information you need in an email message. Also be sure to note that this is related to an upcoming grant application. It'll help us make sure we're steering you in the right direction. Now I'm going to turn it back over to Karen, I think, who's going to talk about funding priorities.
Thank you, April. Obviously, the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission has certain priorities when we look and are attracted to grant projects. We like ones that are very visible, and that are primarily preservation or restoration activities. And preservation extends to these planning category grants too. Obviously, we like ones with a broad support and benefit that certainly reach a number of people and might not just benefit the immediate membership of a certain organization, but, support the programming or future goals of the organization too. And then finally, we prepare every 5 years a preservation plan for Pennsylvania. It's a mandate through our funding through the National Park Service, and we include a lot of public input to prepare this preservation plan there. And it's essentially developed to foster preservation throughout Pennsylvania in all of its community. So needless to say, all of our Keystone funded projects must implement the plan in some way. And you have an opportunity within the application itself to articulate how your project furthers one of these goals and objections of our plan. Our grant review panel evaluates your responses in their selection process. And certainly you can talk about your own mission statements and how this project furthers those plans and how it's in concert with our collective preservation plan. Next slide, please. To sort of help you formulate this, and one of the major things that grew out of the preservation plan was we wanted a way to make sure that grantees could easily find themselves within the plan. So we've sort of developed this easy cheat sheet, so to speak, that separates the 4 goals and the 5 or 6 action items that are within each of those goals to sort of help you frame your answer to that question. I certainly encourage you to read through the whole plan. It's on our website. It actually is stimulating reading. There's some wonderful graphics, and it's very thought-provoking, especially when you see what others in the Pennsylvania community sees and hopes that preservation will be like through the year, is that 2022, I guess. And just remember that the preservation plan is the responsibility of all Pennsylvanians, and we share our responsibility and obligations to further that plan with you as a whole, and certainly we use the Keystone program as a way to further that initiative. Corey's also going to talk about one of our other priorities within the Keystone program to support our CLG communities as well. Thanks, Corey.
Thanks, Karen. And for those of you who might be looking at the PDF version, we are on slide 25, titled Certified Local Government at the top. So the CLG program, as it's known, is a partnership program between the National Park Service, the State Historic Preservation Offices in all 50 states, and local communities. It's a voluntary designation program that recognizes effective and holistic programs at the local levels, typically through in places that have ordinances in place with review boards or preservation commissions who provide advice and some decision making around changes within those communities. There are currently 45 municipalities throughout the state that participate in the Certified Local Government program. You'll see a link in the slides to that list and on our website of those 45 communities. The majority of them are concentrated in the southeastern part of the state, but we do have a healthy number of communities in both the central and western regions that are also participating. And why this matters to the Keystone program is because one of the benefits of participating in this program and sort of agreeing to implement a preservation program according to some effective and best practices is that applicants from within those communities receive bonus points on their Keystone applications. So as Karen has described, eligible Keystone applicants could be the local governments themselves. Maybe they're applying to do the design guidelines or ordinances or updates or plans, as we've discussed, or for a specific property they own. And they would get the bonus points if it's the borough or the township themselves. But also any nonprofit who's located within one of these 45 communities who might be applying, if you supply a letter of support from the municipality with your application, you would receive bonus points on your application as well. So again, this is a way to help the organizations within these communities reap the benefits of the policy work that the policies that the municipality has put in place. You'll find information about this on our website under the Certified Local Government program section. Again, there are links directly to kind of an information sheet about this bonus, this priority funding, as well as a list to the CLGs and the contacts that you should reach out to in each of those communities in order to receive those bonus points. We do ask that give these folks some time to prepare your letters if you're going to be asking for them. So, but you'll find that information there, please. I'd also add that If your community is not currently on this list, there's probably not time. There's definitely not time to complete that certification process before for the current Keystone round, but it is something that you may want to discuss with your municipal leaders about pursuing in the future to help you and other applicants in your communities take advantage of this benefit. Thanks. And next slide.
Just to add to Corey as well, if your CLG contact is not able to prepare and provide you with a letter prior to the March 1st deadline, I can accept them afterwards and upload them in the portal on your behalf. So you can certainly share that with them, that it's not something they necessarily have to have done by March 1st, but I can accept them after the deadline. So thank you. Which also leads me to our next session that talks about how our projects are selected. Although our internal staff initially confirms both the eligibility requirements of the organization and the resource that's associated with the project, most of the projects are, or all of the projects are, and applications are reviewed by an outside grant review panel. We see it as the way to get more local and diverse opinions in the selection process and to make it fair and equitable across the board. I share this with you mainly to make sure that you're aware that although our staff might know an awful lot about your historic resource, those who are reviewing the application may not. So it's an opportunity to really share what makes your property or community special and why it's historically significant and your programming within the application. Don't forget that section. All of our applications are divided into separate panels, so our planning category grants are evaluated separately from the construction evaluations. And as I mentioned, the planning category, we receive about 1/3 of the annual applications, so generally they're lumped together in a single panel for discussion and evaluation. Our panelists are made up of preservation architects or municipal officials, both HARB and commission leaders or CLG members, and they're preservation consultants. We try to get a regional distribution of these panel members throughout the Commonwealth. So again, someone from Erie might not be as familiar with a resource that you have in Montgomery County, although we'll recognize that it's historic and a beautiful property, but you might need to share with them how the programming impacts the resource or why it's special. We do provide them with evaluation guidelines, and we also provide you with the evaluation guidelines that they use. They're folded within the application themselves. We'll talk a little bit about them on our next slide. Shall we? We are asked them to evaluate in 5 areas: the application itself, the preliminary planning that your project team has done to ensure that the project will be completed on time and appropriately, the project itself, whether it furthers the preservation goals of the property or community, and if it's appropriate preservation methodology. And then finally, we do look at community benefit and Commonwealth investment for it. The project narrative and requested attachments are sort of designed to help the panelists evaluate these applications fairly in all 5 categories. So don't forget to check out the program fact sheets for these instructions on some leading questions that help you address their ideas or how they will evaluate it. And finally, I also always mention to pay very close attention to your project budget, that the associated costs are relevant, they're realistic, and they actually are related to the project that you're describing. Next slide, please. Just a side note and one final reminder about projects that are coming into us for stewardship of an individual property. All projects that are focused on a building do need to meet the standards for the treatments of historic properties. If you're not familiar with the Secretary of Interior standards, these are 10 guidelines that help define and identify what character-defining features are or what makes that property special. And your project needs to make sure and ensure that they're sensitive to those characteristics and features and ensure that they'll be preserved so that it's still a historic building once your project is completed. Next slide, please. Just a quick note about the community benefit aspect of our program. Obviously, since we're attracted to projects that are visible in a community and have a strong impact, there's a whole section that lets you talk about your community benefit, not only your programming and the resource itself. We certainly want to help projects that might not get finished without our financial commitment or involvement, but really we want to make a difference in the long-term preservation of your property or enhance the community's understanding of the historic resource or preservation in general. Your project narrative allows you to explain how your project benefits the community, but also don't forget to include letters of support. These showcase the broad spectrum of community interest outside of your immediate bubble of your organization, but you also want to carefully consider who prepares your letters of support. These letters really do demonstrate how important your project is. I can't emphasize that enough. The review panel reads them. They do notice when they're all in the same form letter or they're directed to a different funding agency. And we always encourage you to reach out to your elected state officials, your state senator or representative, to talk about them. It keeps the dialogue so that they know what great things are happening in their district and that you're doing, and also keeps them aware of the Keystone program. But don't forget to include a letter or two from someone who actually benefits from your program or site. If it's let's say you're a historic church and you're doing a conditions assessment, you might want to reach out to your historical society, who would be able to speak about why your property really is historically important. Or if you run a food bank within that entity, someone who utilizes or supports that food bank and can speak to why your programming is so important. You can also talk about some of your non-preservation programming too, because we recognize and appreciate all sort of the activities that happen within historic buildings that make a community special. Next slide, please. In discussing what makes an application competitive in our program, I can't, as Corey mentioned before, and as April has too, please reach out to our staff. Myself and our community coordinators and National Register team are more than willing to and be available to discuss your project over the next several weeks. We can certainly make suggestions to ensure that you're meeting all the relevant information and including the attachments necessary to showcase your project in the best light. Our best applications are the ones that are concise but completely explain what's going to be accomplished with the project. If your project, for example, includes a cultural resource survey, you may want to include the number of resources that will probably be surveyed to help the grant review panel understand the complexities of the project. Well-planned projects are the ones who get funded. We like ones that will be completed within the 24-month grant period, and those that have been vetted by contractors who really have realistic budgets. And don't forget photographs. Even for design guidelines or ones that you might not think or really need photographs, again, the grant review panel appreciates and likes to understand the type of resources that will be captured in that documentation. Next slide. Remember, if you are selected for funding, you will be required to execute a grant contract with the Commonwealth. We do have quarterly reporting requirements. All of our payments, these are not direct award, they are reimbursement requests. So you will submit periodic reimbursements for payment. And again, all final reports and work products will be required before that last reimbursement is made. Next slide. Finally, where to go for additional help within these next few weeks, don't hesitate to go to the website to review the grant guidelines. You can refer back to both this YouTube video or the ones that we've prepared on the other category, or how to navigate the application. My contact information is included here, and then also don't forget to reach out to the Customer Service Center for the application portal if you're having problems with login or get frustrated with how an attachment isn't uploading. They are wonderful assets to talk to as well.
All right, we're going to take our next question break, and I realize that we just went through a tremendous amount of information for you. So just a reminder that we are recording this and it will be available on YouTube. I'll be sending out that link in the next day or two if you need some time to kind of just digest everything that we've covered today. We did get a few questions in. The first is, would a building that is being sold by the state qualify? The idea is the planning grant would give the community greater capacity to understand the preservation implications.
I'll take that one, Shelby. Yes, that's a perfect example as long as the resource has been determined eligible or is listed in the National Register. But we recognize that the current ownership might still be with the Commonwealth, but if this has helped to formulate and encourage its future preservation, we're happy to take that application in the planning grant category. We wouldn't be able to accept a construction grant for that project.
All right, our next question. Can you discuss the types of matching funds that would qualify as a cash match for the grant?
Oh, good question. And I saw a follow-up one about donated professional consulting fees too, as considered a match. So I'll include all this together. Your match can be other federal or state grant funding, organizational funds. Either you've got money in reserves that you can use, or if you're using a capital campaign to do some planning grants, you can certainly include that. We're also able to, recognize anything that comes with cash. The source is not difficult for us. We don't have a formula matrix like some of our sister agencies do that require a certain percentage coming from local as opposed to other state funding. It can all be rolled in together. But again, it all needs to be cash match, especially for the required match. You can accept donated professional services, but it has to be over and above what the cash match is. So if, let's say, your project costs for the project may be $10,000, you can request a $5,000 grant, and maybe the consultant's fees would take the whole project cost up to $15,000, but instead of a $7,500 grant, it's only $5,000.
All right, our next question. Let's see, can a donated professional consultant's fee be considered as a match?
I think I just covered that, Shelby. So yes, not a cash match, but you can include it in your budget as an over and above.
Okay. And can one apply for both a planning grant and a construction grant for two different projects in the same cycle?
Unfortunately not, Peggy. We would like you to segment your project. We have supported projects multiple times, but usually and always in different fiscal years. An organization is excluded from submitting an application in both categories or more than one application in a single category per fiscal year. We'd like you to have the first project finished. The second project would certainly build off of that, but it should be done after the first one is completed.
Okay. And let's see, this one, how much time should be allocated from requesting a SHPO review of NR eligibility to receiving a determination?
Karen, do you want me to take that one?
Please.
Okay. Ideally, we would like you to have your request for eligibility evaluation, your resource survey form, or your updated info, or whatever is appropriate for your particular property and its current status. We would love to have that by the end of January so that we have all of February to complete our review and get you a written response. If you can't make the end of January deadline and you submit information in February, as long as our review is in process, Karen will probably accept your application with the understanding that we will complete our review as soon as we can, and even if it's after the application deadline, to resolve your eligibility status.
That is correct, April. We would need to have that eligibility done by the time the grant review panel meets in late April, but you can go ahead and submit the application by the March 1st deadline and know that we'll do the preliminary review and distribute it to the grant review panel with a request that they review that particular application last until we get that eligibility statement.
But really, the sooner the better, so keep that in mind.
All right, we have one last question that came in. What do you recommend if our organization has an organizational project and is working with a larger community collaborative on a different project?
Lori, we might want to talk offline about this to make sure that I really understand what you're asking, but I would imagine that if your component that your organization is charged with doing supports the larger project, you would focus the application on your organizational component, but you'd certainly want to reference and describe the larger community collaborative project that's being talked about, but your budget should probably just focus on the organizational piece that you're involved with.
All right, thank you, Karen. So that is it, I believe, for the questions that came in. If we missed any that came in through the chat, please get in touch with Karen or April or Corey if it pertains to their sections with any of your questions. So we have about 4 minutes left, so I'm just going to touch on a few things in these last few slides. The first being the Pennsylvania State Historic Preservation Office's Community Initiative Awards. So earlier in this webinar, Karen mentioned Pennsylvania's statewide historic preservation plan, which is actually the hashtag preservation happens here. One of the ways that we implement that plan is through these Community Initiative Awards. These awards, which we started in 2016, recognize the hard work and dedication of organizations, municipalities, agencies, individuals, and others whose work embodies the theme of that statewide historic preservation plan. So the 2019 recipients are the ones that you see on your screens here, and they were chosen as they really demonstrated the value of preserving iconic places and community landmarks through their ownership and stewardship. So starting in the upper left-hand corner is the McKees Rocks Community Development Corporation for their work to preserve the Roxy Theater. Then in the upper right-hand corner, we have Tinicum Township for their work to save the historic Lazaretto from demolition and to rehabilitate the property into township offices. The lower right corner, we have gave the award to the team behind the rebirth of the Mahoning Drive-In Theater, which is in Carbon County. And then lastly, in the lower left-hand corner, an award was given to Mike Madden. He's the son of NFL's John Madden, for any of you football fans, and his team for their work to preserve Muhammad Ali's Fighters Heaven training camp and open it as a free museum and camp. We'll be announcing our 2020 awards within the next few weeks. And if you're interested in learning more about these awards, you can go to our blog, pahistoricpreservation.com, and just do a simple keyword search for community. So you're probably wondering what this has to do with you guys, and while we're mentioning it here, it's one of the things that's really important to us here at the PA SHPO and for communicating the importance of historic preservation to everybody that we talk to, our legislators, different funding sources and so forth, is that there is really great preservation work happening everywhere in Pennsylvania, and we certainly don't have a handle on all of those amazing things that people like you are doing out there. So we use these Community Initiative Awards to encourage people to share that great news with us, and it's very simple to do that. Simply use the Preservation Happens Here hashtag in your social media posts when you're sharing updates and news about your projects, whether it's a Keystone project or some other type of project. We do monitor that. And another way, if you're not on social media or a big fan, we have an online form through SurveyMonkey that you can get there through these slides. After February 22nd, when PA Share comes online, you'll be able to send us your success stories that way. But these two ways are two of the 3 or 4 different ways that we make up our list every year for candidates to consider for those preservation community initiative awards. So lastly, as I mentioned, PA Share. I am just going to touch on a few things because I see we're here at 11 o'clock. As we've mentioned throughout the presentation, this is our new online data management and GIS tool that is going to replace CRGIS. We are expecting that it will come online February 22nd, 2021. And as I mentioned, CRGIS will go offline on March 1st. PA Share is really a planning tool. It will help you access data for information and planning, allow you to submit and track projects online, and we have a handy field survey and field survey management reporting tool called Surveyor, which is like, I'm told, having PA Share right in your pocket with you. We do have 4 different access points. We had a question earlier in the webinar about a cost related to PA Share. And so we have a couple of different options that you'll see up here on the screen. There's more information on our website. If you go to the PA Share tab, we have a guest anonymous user that's free. It has limited functionality. A basic user where you do need to have a Keystone login, which is the same one I understand that you need to have to do the DCD's single application for assistance. So if you have one for that, you'll be able to use that for PA Share. The basic access allows you to submit projects and view some of our data. Then we have some paid subscription accounts that give you a lot more convenient functionality, full access to our data, a lot of sophisticated mapping and searching, and access to that surveyor tool that I mentioned. The Pro subscription is available at $50 a month and $275 a year, since we did have that question. The business account, which allows you up to 5 users, is available at $275 a month or $875 a year. So just a quick recap, some critical things you need to know, where to register for that Keystone login, that this will be available to everybody on February 22nd. We will have lots of different types of training tools that you can use to get to know our new system and how to use it for the most benefit to you. And you can stay informed here at our blog, pahistoricpreservation.com. And then on this last slide, I'll end it here. Just some links. You'll be able to get these links from the PDF of the presentation that we sent to some of the different communications that we have here. And I see we had a question. What is the annual deadline for nominations, and when will the Community Initiative Awards be given or awarded next? We don't really have a deadline, and to be honest, we don't have an application per se. Certainly people using the hashtag, submitting success stories or information to us through that SurveyMonkey website, or soon it will be PA Share through the success story wizard. It's because we don't have a formal application process and we don't have kind of a formal deadline. Our schedule the last few years have been that we, the staff, vote on the candidates. We rank them and staff vote on them, and that usually happens in the fall. And our 2020 awardees were notified in December, and we'll be putting out a blog announcing those awardees next week. I believe that's on the schedule. We had one last question that I think we'll take before we call it a day. Karen, I'm going to ask you to respond to this one. Have the Commonwealth funds allocated to support Keystone grants been confirmed?
Yes, that came out of I guess the real question or answer is yes. We are using funding that was allocated in this budget year, so it's 21 2021. So that did pass with the Commonwealth budget in July. So our funding is secure. We do have a slight decrease from what we had in fiscal year 19 and 20. There generally is not a whole lot of fluctuation. Our funding source comes from the Keystone Conservation Park and Recreation Fund, which is funded through the realty transfer tax. And so far, the real estate market has remained pretty healthy. So the estimates coming into that revenue stream have been close to what was estimated and allocated for us.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Karen, and thank you very, very much to all of our other speakers today, April France and Corey Kegarais. I think with that, we will end today's webinar. Thank you very much for attending and for your interest in the Keystone Historic Preservation Grant program. Everybody have a wonderful day.